What is going on, everybody? It is Dylan with Astrodfs, and in today's video, I'm going over some wide receiver rooms to be cautious about in fantasy for 2025. So this isn't really to say avoid at all costs, but this is just be cautious of what you're getting into when taking a wide receiver from this team. Starting it off is Buffalo, where Buffalo was very, very good offensively last season. Josh Allen, James Cook were two of the best at their position. The wide receiver room, for the most part, wasn't anything special. If you're like me and like Khalil Shakir, he paid off. He was a consistent guy, and yeah, he was probably a flex guy in your lineups, but at a flex spot, the consistency that he gave you was really good. If you were invested in someone like Keon Coleman, Dalton Kincaid, even Amari Cooper, once he got traded to the team, I mean, it really didn't pay off for the most part at those three. But this year, now with Shakir possibly missing, maybe the first week of the season, we'll see as we get closer. But you still have Keon Coleman going into year two. They add Josh Palmer. They add Elijah Moore. They still have Curtis Samuel. So this wide receiver room, kind of shaky, right? If Khalil Shakir is there, I think the more consistent piece you have is Khalil Shakir, but he's still not a top elite wide receiver, and that's just because of how good and efficient the run game has been with Josh Allen and James Cook. Ray Davis emerged last season. Ty Johnson's going to have his moments, but overall, it's a team that plays well defensively, is very efficient offensively, especially in the run game, and they use the passes when they need to. But outside Khalil Shakir, I mean, you're taking a big risk on either hoping Keon Coleman takes a huge step up from where he was last year going into year two, the acquired Josh Palmer, who figures to be the deep ball threat of this team. I mean, we've seen Josh Palmer have some really good games for fantasy and then games where he's non-existent, right? He's a deep ball threat. Elijah Moore kind of emerged in Cleveland last season, but I mean, a lot of the Cleveland pass catchers did, right? You just needed somebody that wasn't Deshaun Watson throwing the ball, someone like Jameis Winston to go out there and just throw it. But yeah, you still have someone like Curtis Samuel, who his role is probably going to be towards the bottom of this wide receiver depth chart. But it's probably going to be Shakir, Coleman, and Palmer when all healthy. If Shakir's out, then yeah, you're probably going to get Elijah Moore and Curtis Samuel mixed in there. But yeah, overall, I don't see an elite type of production needed from this wide receiver room. If you're grabbing one of these guys, it's either a bench piece or a flex piece. So just be cautious. The ADP isn't bad on any of them. Even Shakir, right? You're drafting Shakir at a flex spot at that. But if he does miss a week or two, that could change the way we look at this. The next team I want to talk about is the Carolina Panthers. And Carolina Panthers is such a difficult situation to kind of evaluate of what we're going to get. Obviously, we get a top 10 pick in Ted McMillan this season for the Panthers. You still have Adam Thielen, who has been, when healthy, and Bryce Young was starting. The connection between Bryce Young and Adam Thielen was really good and really good for fantasy, where Adam Thielen was putting up crazy good numbers for a wide receiver that is older and on a bad team. But we saw the connection later in the season when Bryce Young was starting again and Adam Thielen was healthy. They had a huge connection, just like they did in Bryce Young's rookie season. Then you have a top round pick in Xavier Legette the season before, where it wasn't the prettiest for Xavier Legette, and obviously there were problems with the quarterback situation with Bryce Young not playing well in the beginning, and then you go Andy Dalton. But Xavier Legette had a huge opportunity when Adam Thielen missed some games, and if you go and look at the numbers, he did not put up really good numbers. He had one good week where he was a top 12 wide receiver. Other than that, he did not crack a top 24 wide receiver at all the rest of the season. And it's very worrisome when you go and draft another wide receiver the year after to kind of replace Legette in that aspect. And then you had undrafted free agent who I was a huge fan of and glad he got his opportunities and looked good in some of the opportunities he got, which is Jalen Coker. So now you already have four. They add someone like Hunter Renfrow, who we heard why he was out of the league, and everything we've heard so far in the camp is very positive for Hunter Renfrow. So that adds another wide receiver in the mix. And then another late round draft pick in Jimmy Horn Jr. coming from Colorado, who this guy is yes, he's another guy that's making some noise at that wide receiver position. So I think the wide receiver room isn't set. I think if you want to be honest, it's going to be Tet, it's going to be Adam Thielen, and then figuring out who that third wide receiver kind of figures into. and whether that's Xavier Legette, Jalen Coker to start. They're going to have some plays for Hunter Renfrow. I would imagine Jimmy Horn, if he does make the 53-man roster, is probably going to be, non-existent for the beginning. But once you get towards the end of the season, it's going to be really hard to predict where this snap share is going to be. I think if you want that guarantee, it's Ted McMillan. Obviously, we haven't seen that Bryce Young, Ted McMillan chemistry yet, besides, training camp and stuff like that. But Adam Thielen is the safer bet, but he is getting older. They are bringing in younger pieces to help, Bryce Young and the future of this team. Obviously, with the cap situation that every team has to face. But, you add someone like Hunter Renfrow, who, everything we have seen so far has been positive for him. We saw what he can be in the past. Obviously, it's been a few years since we've seen it, but we know what that could be and if it ends up happening in Carolina. So Carolina's another tough one. Ted McMillan, you're spending a good draft pick on him in fantasy drafts. Adam Thielen, Xavier Legette, Jalen Coker, Hunter Renfrow. These are guys that are late in drafts and undrafted, so it's not like you're spending a high draft pick on any of them. But it is something you have to be skeptical when taking a wide receiver from this team, is figuring out where that wide receiver room is going to look like at the end of the season. And this isn't saying any injuries. This is just saying of pure talent, right? Adam Thielen is only getting older. We know how he's been in the last 2 seasons in Carolina, and when he's healthy, and when Bryce Young is his quarterback, right? We've seen a really good connection between the two, but at some point that age is going to be a factor, and they are going to have to use and decide what they're going to do with someone like Xavier Legette, if they're going to, move on from him in that essence, or if they're going to give him another opportunity this season, which they should based off of the draft capital. But when you have someone like Jalen Coker, who did emerge and have some good opportunities last season for Carolina when Adam Thielen missed some games, Xavier Legette wasn't really performing, and there was just an opportunity. The talent wasn't there for a third wide receiver, and he stepped up. And then, like I said, you have Hunter Renfrow and Jimmy Horn. One is an older wide receiver now. The other one's young, so didn't get a lot of draft capital out of him, so it's not like they need to play him either. But I'd be really surprised to see where this snap share ends up for this wide receiver room outside of Ted McMillan, who even Ted McMillan is still a question mark, right? We could say that we love the talent and we know what he's going to be, but we've seen wide receivers taken in the first round that don't end up being that elite wide receiver. So I am very interested to see where this wide receiver room ends. Continuing on with talented wide receiver rooms is the Green Bay Packers, and this one is just a cluster, and it's going to be very hard to determine what this wide receiver room looks like. I honestly thought we'd see a trade or something with one of these wide receivers of the Packers, whether it be Watson, Dobbs, Wicks, something to get value, because otherwise you have a very kind of stacked, and I don't want to say stacked in like a good way, but I think the talent is very balanced between a lot of these guys now, and all they did was just add another wide receiver in Matthew Golden. So the Packers last season, if you go and look at where the wide receiver finishes were, Jaden Reed finished the best out of all the wide receivers. Clearly, he had some really good weeks. He also had some weeks where he was not good for your fantasy lineups, and where he started the season, where he had the wide receiver 1 week 1, wide receiver 2 week 4, and then had some varies of a top 24 wide receiver. But we also saw Romeo Dobbs have a couple good weeks. We saw Dontavian Wicks have a good week or two. Christian Watson surprisingly had a good week or two. And then, a mix of Malik Heath and Bo Helton getting in some plays, but it wasn't really impactful. Where now you add a first-round pick in Matthew Golden. Savion Williams is a name that has gotten some in camp, but I don't think he makes this roster, for being honest. And they add someone like Mecole Hardman, who I would assume is going to be there for a return specialist. I can't see the wide receiver room unless they do plan on trading someone away. But now you have Jaden Reed, Matthew Golden, Romeo Dobbs, Christian Watson, Dontavian Wicks, and then a mix. You could say a mix of 3 names for the last spot, but someone like Savion Williams, Mecole Hardman, Malik Heath, those guys are going to be fighting for that 6th spot if they do go 6 wide receivers. The big problem with this team, and is difficult to kind of judge, is they have Josh Jacobs. They're even when they didn't and they had Aaron Jones, they're very focused on establishing the run game and playing off the run game, right? If the run game's working, they're going to play really good football the entirety of that game, because their defense is good enough to where they could play off the run, right? Their defense is able to stop teams consistently, right? Wasn't elite or anything like that. And this season, we've seen their defense kind of change in some aspects. So don't have, one of the top cornerbacks in Jair Alexander. Their DB room kind of looks scary. But you still have Josh Jacobs, right? You still have one of the better consistent running backs in the league, a really good offensive line as well. And not even that, right? Not even just the wide receiver room, but you have Tucker Kraft at tight end, who he is another one that stepped up when he needed to, right? So this wide receiver room is just very, very difficult. Jayden Reed, honestly, is for me, the guy I want to get out of this wide receiver room, but the question mark around Matthew Golden of what role is he going to play on this offense? How much targets is he going to get? Is he going to be the deep ball threat, which we saw someone like Jayden Reed be? Where is this wide receiver room going to end up, right? Who's going to be that wide receiver 2-3 on this team? It's Jayden Reed and then who, right? And even Jayden Reed isn't some elite top wide receiver, right? I think if you want to compare it, you compare Jayden Reed to someone like Khalil Shakir, to where Khalil Shakir overall was more consistent, but he didn't have those top numbers that Jayden Reed was able to get last season, right? He didn't have wide receiver one, like the wide receiver one type of week, but Jayden Reed had more bottom weeks. He had more weeks that hurt your team rather than helped your team. We saw Romeo Doubs, Christian Watson have some really good weeks for your team, and then yet again, they were non-existent. They had games where they got under 5 points, which hurts your team bad. So, yeah, besides Jayden Reed, I don't know what this wide receiver room is going to be. I don't know who's going to take the wide receiver 2-3, right? It's not guaranteed that Matthew Golden just automatically gets a top snap share on this offense, right? We're not even talking about targets. We're talking about snaps. So it's not even guaranteed that he's going to get a lot of snaps. Obviously, if you spend a first-round pick on a wide receiver, you want to get him into your offense and want to get those snaps. But seeing that they have not moved a wide receiver, they're pretty happy with the way their wide receiver room is, to where they could throw Dontavian Wicks in for a play, right? And they have a play designed for Wicks or Romeo Doubs. So as much as I love how even the talent is on this wide receiver room, it's also very challenging because you're going to have some good weeks out of some of them, and you're going to have some bottom weeks out of a lot of them. So just be cautious when you're targeting this Green Bay offense, right? I think it's going to be more consistently better for the wide receivers, but you're not going to have one guy kind of be that consistently elite wide receiver on this team, which is the worry when taking any of these guys. The next team that I want to talk about is the New England Patriots. Man, is this team going to be a big question mark all season, right? To where you still have a Drake May year 2 quarterback going into it. Offensive line that's still trying to figure out what they want to be. They get a former offensive coordinator that was with the franchise years ago. Didn't work out in Vegas. Now he's back. And man, I have struggled to try to predict where this wide receiver room is. I love Stefon Diggs. If Stefon Diggs could be healthy, yes, I think the upside for Stefon Diggs is huge. But you do have to have that conversation that he is getting older. He is coming off of a major injury. But if he can remain healthy, yes, he's going to be a top wide receiver for this team and in the league. He's going to be a good wide receiver to have on your fantasy teams. Demario Douglas, I love Demario Douglas. I think he was a guy that, wasn't brought into that team to be an elite talent, wasn't, ever profiled as that, but a guy that just is a dependable wide receiver, right? It isn't really going to shine and get you a big play, but is a guy that you can depend on a 3rd and 5 situation, pass the ball to him, get the first down. Is he going to be a huge touchdown guy? No, probably not either. So what did they do this offseason? They brought in and paid Mac Hollins. They brought in Stefon Diggs, obviously. They draft Kyle Williams. So this wide receiver room is confusing, right? I think it's safe to say that Stefon Diggs is going to be their wide receiver 1, right? Or at least have that snap share of being the wide receiver 1. And then you would figure Demario Douglas is a wide receiver 2. He was the most consistent wide receiver for that team. But then you run into rookie Kyle Williams, who has a lot of buzz this offseason. Heard a lot of good things about him. Heard a lot of good things in this camp. We'll see as the preseason happens, kind of see what their plan is with him. But you paid Mac Hollins, right? You paid Mac Hollins, and it's just not a small contract, right? They paid him upwards of $5 million. Typically, when you do that to a wide receiver, you're going to utilize them in some aspect. So now you have to decide who is your wide receiver 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right? Because you still have Kayshon Boutte, you still have Kendrick Bourne, you still have a pick that you spent a good draft pick on in Jalen Polk, and then you had a guy that last offseason kind of got some hype, but it died down. We really didn't see him at all. Like, he barely even played, but Javon Baker. So interested to see of what this wide receiver room looks like to start the season, of who makes the 53-man roster. But yeah, this wide receiver room this offseason is going to be very questionable, right? Because you still don't have an established offense. You don't have a really good offensive line. Obviously, you spent a good draft pick on Travion Henderson to bring him in. You paid Ramondre Stevenson. So you bring in a lot of comfort and safety, and try to build up the confidence of Drake May, to where we saw a lot of good moments out of Drake May last season. We also saw some bad moments that necessarily weren't all his fault either. But the pass game was not terrific in New England last season. And obviously they addressed it. They brought in 2 wide receivers. They drafted another wide receiver. They're carrying some of the guys they did last season. So yes, this wide receiver room is going to be very difficult to decide on who you're getting, right? I think the clear-cut choice, if you want to take a receiver, is Stephon Diggs. He has the most upside, the highest ceiling on this team. If you want a more safety valve bench piece to kind of have on your team, right, I don't recommend starting him. But if you have a bye week to where you're missing 2 wide receivers, someone like Demario Douglas in a good matchup is going to be good for you this fantasy season. And then Kyle Williams, right? Kyle Williams is that kind of question mark of, is he going to transition to the NFL? Can he overtake Mac Hollins, Demario Douglas, and get that wide receiver 2 role? Or where will someone like Kayshon Boutte, who we've seen some good moments come out of him, will he kind of stay healthy and kind of develop a little more? And then what does Jalen Polk do? Does Jalen Polk just kind of, is he gone, right? A different coaching staff? Did they just get rid of him? I don't know. I don't truly know, but if you were to ask me what wide receiver I want, obviously it's Stephon Diggs. But if I want to test and kind of get that higher ceiling, possibly Kyle Williams, right? But I don't recommend drafting him. It's more kind of pick him up if there's a really good matchup and we know one of those wide receivers is in, until we start to see what his role is. But like I said, you paid Mac Hollins. Demario Douglas was your guy last year. And then Stephon Diggs, obviously you brought him in for a reason. You're paying him for a reason. So it's going to be kind of a bumpy road for Kyle Williams to start, but towards the end of the season, we might see him emerge, hopefully, if you're buying into him. And the last but not least is the San Francisco 49ers. And this one is kind of for a different reason, right? The other ones were maybe some underperforming offenses, some lower scoring offenses, especially for fantasy. This one is one of the better fantasy offenses that we see. And that is the 49ers with Brandon Ayuk, Juwan Jennings, and Ricky Pearsall being their wide receiver 1, 2, 3. We know, right, if healthy, this is their wide receiver 1, 2, and 3. The question mark is trying to decide who takes that role, right? Who can go to that top wide receiver spot on this team? We already know if Christian McCaffrey's in, he's their biggest weapon. We know the threat that George Kittle is at tight end. His role is safe. We don't know who's going to be healthy and who's going to step up for that wide receiver room in San Francisco, where we saw Brandon Ayuk. If you go and look at Brandon Ayuk's numbers last season, he finished as over 100 for a wide receiver, mostly because he was hurt. But you look at his numbers, he had one wide receiver 1 week where he was a top 12 wide receiver once. That was it. Other than that, he really didn't help your team. You know who did? Juwan Jennings. But he only had one really good week up until week 10. And then he had some really, really good weeks. But by that time, you possibly dropped him off your teams, unless you had him on the IL. But you probably dropped him off of your teams. And then you had Ricky Pearsall, who was recovering another guy that, got shot and was recovering. And when you had someone like Deebo Samuel, Juwan Jennings, and then Brandon Ayuk, kind of when Brandon Ayuk went out is when we got to see Ricky Pearsall, and we didn't really see a top version of him. The last 2 weeks of the season, we were able to see that, but that was without Deebo Samuel, that was without Brandon Ayuk. It was Ricky Pearsall and Juwan Jennings, but we did see some good numbers out of Ricky Pearsall. The question mark is where you're going to take these guys in your fantasy drafts, because you're not spending, yet again, you're not spending an elite pick on any of these guys. You're not spending hopefully a top 5 pick on them, but you are going to have that conversation with yourself of, hey, what guy do I want to take a shot on? Because one of these guys is going to have a really good fantasy season, right? One of these guys is going to beat their ADP by a long shot, right? Juwan Jennings finished as a wide receiver 2 last season. He wasn't being taken as a wide receiver 2. He was undrafted in most leagues. So Juwan Jennings, yes. If Juwan Jennings can come out there healthy, I think he's the clear-cut choice early on until Brandon Ayuk gets back, that he's the wide receiver 1. Ricky Pearsall, I could see the upside of Ricky Pearsall overtaking Juwan Jennings as far as a ceiling type, but I think the more consistent guy early on for this wide receiver room is going to be Juwan Jennings. Towards the end of the season, if Brandon Ayuk comes back and he's healthy and moving the way he's supposed to, yes, I think Brandon Ayuk passes both Jennings and Pearsall, but you're hoping that not only does Ayuk come back healthy, but that injury doesn't kind of linger all season, which we've seen when you have a major injury. We've seen guys not go back to 100%, even though they're allowed to play. We don't see that same talent we saw before the injury. So this is a wide receiver room to where, yes, it's going to be very question what pick you're going to want to spend on these guys, right? Ricky Pearsall, I think, has the best value as far as ADP, just because he gets taken after the other two. But it doesn't guarantee you to get, better fantasy value out of it, right? Just because he's drafted later doesn't mean he's necessarily going to perform better than both of those two. So, yet again, I love this wide receiver room. I think when they're all healthy and this team is healthy, it's going to be great. Their defense went through a huge overhaul. They have a really easy schedule this season. I love the wide receiver room. It's pretty much just those 3 guys, right? You have Demarcus Robinson. They brought in Robbie Chosen. They brought in some other names to kind of fill out and take a role, but it's Brandon Ayuk, Juwan Jennings, Ricky Pearsall. Those are the only 3 I'm concerned about in that wide receiver room currently. Who do you take though, right? So if you had to ask me the guy I would take based off of where he's going and he's falling, especially in underdog drafts, is Brandon Ayuk, right? If Brandon Ayuk can come back healthy, he is an elite wide receiver. We've seen him be elite. Juwan Jennings is probably the more safer bet, especially early on in your fantasy leagues. And then Ricky Pearsall is kind of that question mark, right? Does he take a step forward? Do we see what kind of happened at the end of the last season develop into this season? Or was that just a fluke because you didn't have Deebo Samuel or Brandon Ayuk there? So hope you guys did enjoy the video. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe. I do underdog best ball live drafts all the time. So if you guys are interested in just hanging out, coming to see who I take and just talk football, always pop in and check in. Other than that, guys, thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.